And you mentioned earlier the Socratic Method, and I'm curious to ask, like, for anyone listening that is maybe new to this term or maybe has like an idea of what it is, how would you describe it in simple terms? What is the Socratic Method?
Let me think about it's notoriously difficult to describe because at no point does Socrates in Xenophon or Plato or anywhere else sit down and say, "Let me explain my method to you." Actually, even that's not. There is a point where he does something that's close to that, and I'll come back to it in a moment because it's a bit of an odd case, right? But generally, the way we learn about the Socratic method is by observing Socrates doing it. So Plato and Xenophon write dialogues. We should pause over that for a moment. Virtually nobody writes philosophical dialogues anymore. It's a pretty largely extinct literary genre, right? So I think it seems all like nowadays people are impatient. People want tweets, they want sound bites. You know, they want that laughter. That's partly why people love Marcus Aurelius so much today, because Marcus Aurelius writes in tweets, like almost, he writes these like aphorisms. He's really good at it, and it's an important literary genre. The dialogue art form is more around the houses and requires a little bit more patience to read sometimes. But what it does is give you a sense of something that's hard to quantify. We tend to think of wisdom as holding correct opinions. People think if they watch enough Joe Rogan videos, they're going to, walk away smarter and more informed, which I think is a mistake. Like if people think they can read certain books and just, memorize stuff, Socrates was very concerned with this idea that we could just acquire opinions passively, like buying a bag of onions from a greengrocer. You would just go buy a book, watch a YouTube video, like absorb it, repeat it to other people, and you'd have gained wisdom. So for Socrates, what is wisdom then if it's not just parroting opinions? For Socrates, the wisdom really is more dynamic. It's a cognitive skill, right? So even if sometimes people are frustrated with Plato's dialogues because they end in what's called apareia, like which means kind of bewilderment. It literally means lacking a path forward. Like it's a state of confusion or bewilderment. And often the interlocutors go, I still don't know what wisdom is. I still don't know what justice is, but I feel like I've made some sort of progress, right? What they've gained is cognitive flexibility. Like they've seen beyond their rigid assumptions and they've learned to view the question from a number of different perspectives. And for Socrates, it's this flexibility, like the ability to actually engage in thinking as a cognitive skill, I think that constitutes the core of wisdom. Wisdom is the Socratic method. Like being good at the Socratic method is to be wise, I think. Like it's at least more so for Socrates than we would normally assume. So what does that method consist in? Well, the typical way that it's explained is, generally speaking, Socrates will ask his interlocutor to define a concept in a sentence or so, to give a simple verbal definition. And he usually picks something that they care about, that's relevant to their lives. So the famous example is he's talking to some Athenian generals in a dialogue called the Lackeys. He's talking to Lackeys in Nicaeus. And they're arguing about the type of training they should pay for their sons to have a type of combat training, whether it's worth the investment or not. And Socrates says, well, you seem to really be presupposing the concept of courage. Like that's what this whole discussion is about, in a sense. But we haven't defined what courage is. So he says, underlying this conversation, there's an assumption. Like it's a concept that we're all taking for granted. What is courage? And they usually begin by giving a simple definition. So I think it's Nicaeus that says courage consists in standing your ground in the face of the enemy, which would have been like the most obvious definition to him because you had to hammer that into hoplites or infantrymen who are fighting in the phalanx formation. The one thing that you have to do is stay in formation. It's really absolutely crucial. That's all you've got to do. You've got one job, just stay in formation and stab the guy in front of you with a spear, right? Basically, but do not break formation, right? So stand in your ground in the face of the enemy. Blah, blah, blah. He's probably said this a gazillion times to like the soldiers that he's training. And Socrates says, right, this is like a valid definition. However, and then so we've got a definition of a virtue that seems relevant to people. Socrates will then question it. So sometimes people say, well, what sort of questions did he ask? He doesn't ask formulaic questions, right? Generally speaking, what he does is kind of creatively brainstorm exceptions to the definition and then ask the other person, like, how that fits. And so Socrates will say, for example, what if you're in the cavalry? And the case is like, huh? Like Socrates says, the cavalry charge at the enemy. They don't stand their ground in the face of the enemy. But surely they're courageous. And he's like, well, that's different, Socrates, right? That's kind of like an exception. And Socrates says, what about the Spartans? They charge into the enemy and break formation like cavalry do. Like they're famous for fighting in this way. But no one would doubt their courage. And the case is like, okay, well, maybe there's some exceptions to this definition. And Socrates is like, well, what if you're fighting a tactical retreat? I mean, you can exhibit bravery if you don't drop your shields and flee, but you retreat in a tactical, in self-disciplined manner. Surely that's courageous. And then you're not standing your ground in the face of the enemy. And the case is like, okay. And then Socrates is like, what about in civilian life as well? Surely you can exhibit courage in civilian life, and then your definition doesn't really work then, right? It's too narrow, basically. So Socrates is really good at brainstorming exceptions to generalizations, basically. And he uses that skill to force people to begin to see things in a more nuanced and flexible way. Sometimes he'll then also question whether the definition is not too narrow, but in some cases it might become too broad. So he'll begin to say, but your definition would include this, and that's not courage, right? So maybe you need to narrow it a little bit as well. So he'll tend to highlight contradictions between their use of a concept and their definition of it. And he'll highlight other types of contradiction in their thinking, as we mentioned earlier, the double standards technique. So he'll say you apply this concept in one way to yourself, but you apply it in a different way to other people. So there's a number of ways that he'll tend to highlight these contradictions. A couple of odd things, but there are many things you could say about the Socratic method. Socrates is really good at remembering stuff that people said ages ago. So he'll be like, like 10 minutes ago when you were talking about something else, you said, so that contradicts what you're saying now. Been really annoying, right? But he's very good at doing that. I mean, he's a very skilled individual. He does this all day long. But he also feigns having a bad memory, paradoxically. So if someone's giving a very long speech, Socrates will often interrupt them and ask them to kind of back up, and he'll question things that they've taken for granted. This reminds me of a famous anecdote about a Spartan king. So one of the sophists supposedly came to Sparta. I don't think they had many sophists in Sparta. It wasn't their thing. And he gave a speech about the nature of justice, kingship, and so on. And then at the end, he asked the king what he thought of it. And the Spartan allegedly said, well, it was so long that I can't remember the beginning. And therefore, I didn't understand the middle. And therefore, I can't agree with your conclusion. And this is the kind of feeling that you get from Socrates sometimes. He thinks that when people give these big elaborate speeches about a subject, it's kind of an intellectual smokescreen. And often the weakest part of their argument is something that they're taking for granted that's gone unspoken at the beginning. So within if you're going to challenge what they're saying, you should probably stop them right at the beginning and say, whoa, back up. Everything you've said is like a house of cards because it's built on some premise that's maybe not true, right? So the Socratic method will usually consist in getting people to define a concept and then help them to identify possible exceptions to it and contradictions in their thinking. And that leads them to refine the concept. Often it leads to a sense of confusion, but it helps them to develop a cognitive skill that's related to what psychologists today call cognitive flexibility. Right. So again, it seems odd to say this, but because we tend to think in terms of content rather than process. So we think, well, wisdom would consist in knowing something, right, or having some sort of correct opinion. But maybe what contributes to emotional resilience and well-being is your ability to see things from multiple perspectives, right? Your ability to think outside the box, as it were. That's what research tends to show. Right. In therapy, invariably, the psychological problems that people have tend to revolve around rigid thinking. So people will have rules that they follow. They'll have rigid core beliefs. So someone will have a fundamental assumption about themselves that they're worthless or stupid. if they're clinically depressed. That's pretty common, right? Now you can say, well, that's like a really weirdly sweeping, it's a global rating of value, right? It's a very broad, very sweeping thing to say about any person. I mean, everyone says stupid things sometimes, right? But you probably are capable of saying intelligent things in other contexts as well, right? So making these sweeping generalizations seems to be kind of endemic in mental health problems, right? So usually a lot of therapy consists in helping people to challenge them, but the cognitive skill of generally seeing beyond these assumptions and being able to question overly simplistic rules and rigid beliefs is, I think, fundamental to good mental health in general. Now, I would defer to talking about something which is, I said Socrates never really sits down and says, hey, guys, let me just explain how this method works, right? But in one of Zen, and again, this is in Xenophon, not in Plato. So there's a dialogue in Zen. When I read Xenophon in particular, I often think, am I hallucinating here, right? Because he clearly says X, Y, and Z, and how come no one ever mentioned this to me before? No one ever told me. There's a bit in Xenophon where Socrates sits down with a young man who's trying to learn the Socratic method. He's got a collection of books that he uses for self-improvement. So this guy is called Euthydemus. There's actually two young men called Euthydemus. This is another one from the one that's in Plato's Dialogue. So this Euthydemus is a self-help junkie. He has a collection of books from sophists and other wise men, and he says he's learning the maxims of the wise, is how he puts it. And Socrates says that's commendable. But let's put to the test your understanding of them. We're going to give you a kind of exam, by using the Socratic method. And he teaches him the Socratic method, right? So fundamentally there, he's saying just memorizing maxims isn't enough. You need to understand how to apply them and to notice exceptions to them and modify them in different contexts and stuff like that. That's the cognitive skill that real wisdom consists in. So he begins teaching them this method, and he does it by drawing a diagram. It's like, no one ever told me that, right? What does this diagram look like? Socrates draws two columns, presumably on a wax tablet, although we're not told, right? So he draws two columns. Now, immediately, right, I guarantee you that at this very minute, as we're speaking, somewhere in the world, there's at least one cognitive therapist in a consulting room somewhere, probably many, right now, drawing two columns on a flip chart, doing essentially the same technique. We just call it the two-column technique. It's one of the most common techniques used in cognitive therapy today. So as soon as I read that, I thought, how come no one's ever mentioned this to me? He's straight up, I thought, I need to read this again. I need to check the original Greek. Am I imagining this? Am I hallucinating? He straight up says to this young guy, let's draw two columns, and we'll head one justice and the other injustice. Actually uses the initial letters of the Greek words, but, that's beside the point. So they want to test his understanding of justice. And he says, can you give me some examples of injustice? And Euthydemus says, that's easy. For example, lying, stealing, stuff like that. So far so good, right? So already there's a bit of a process going on here. Socrates is getting someone to give examples in order to develop a definition of a core value, right? That's of great interest to him, right? That he thinks he already understands what justice and injustice are and the difference between them, because he's read all these books about it. And he says it's easy to give examples. But then Socrates, again, just brainstorms exceptions. He says, well, hang on a minute. Let's start with lying. Suppose you're an elected general, like the Athenians elected their generals, and you deceive the enemy during warfare. Is that unjust? And Euthydemus is like, well, that's different, Socrates. Come on. That's like an exception, right? Socrates is like, oh, right, I see. So suppose you're a parent and you've got a small child, and the only way that you can get them to take medicine, when they're sick, is to conceal it in their food. That's deception, right? You're lying to them. Is that unjust? And Euthydemus is like, well, that's different, Socrates, right? That's like an exception to the definition. Socrates is, all right, I get it. What if your friend is suicidal and they ask you where you hid their dagger? This is like a famous example. It comes up over and over again in philosophy. Would it be just to tell them and allow them to kill themselves? Or would it be unjust to tell them, sorry, I don't know where it is? like to tell a white lie or whatever, like in order to save their life. And Euthydemus is like, okay, right. So maybe it's a bit of a generalization to say that injustice consists in things like lying. Maybe in some situations it might be considered just, like to lie, or maybe appropriate or acceptable. And the same goes for stealing. Like he says, for example, what if you seize the weapons of your enemy during warfare? And Euthydemus is like, well, like, that's okay. That's normal. And Socrates is like, well, isn't that kind of stealing? And Euthydemus is like, yeah, but like that's okay. That's not unjust. So there's an exception to this as well, right? And so what Socrates is teaching him is that it's okay to articulate concepts and try and define them. We have to start with some kind of definition, but we also have to be able to see beyond it. And real wisdom would consist in being able to notice where the definition doesn't really work anymore, like, and spot the exceptions to it. Like, that's when you're really thinking, like, for yourself. Like, and so, like, he basically said, the way he phrases it is he says, okay, we'll put lying and stealing under injustice. Under what circumstances might we move them across to the other column, like, and list them under justice? And he keeps asking this technique and getting him to revise his definition of what justice consists in. So he has a teaching aid for helping him to develop one of the basic skills that's required for the Socratic method. And like I said, it just so happens it's the same teaching aid that we use in modern cognitive therapy. And we use it in a number of different ways. I would say, this is the ability to do this is one of the most important psychological skills that people can learn. And it's not really highlighted in our texts on Stoicism, but I believe that the Stoics took it for granted.
And for those of us that are not super well versed in psychological research and stuff like that, as you mentioned, there's so much on psychological rigidity leading to all sorts of disorders and anxiety and all sorts of things that we might want to avoid. But I'm curious about, and maybe, as you mentioned, maybe it's a little bit paradoxical. If you read Plato's Apology, it doesn't necessarily read as someone that is absent of rigidity. There is some rigidity there, as well as, this stress of cognitive flexibility. Like, how do you think about holding both of those at the same time?
I think Socrates did have moral beliefs, but he was open-minded about them, right?
Yeah.
This is what's just to me, and I honestly, I really think many people today are very confused about this, and they misinterpret, for example, Stoicism. Like, for example, there's a whole bunch of people today that seem to me to want to turn Stoicism into a kind of religion, like almost like a cult. And they have this idea that all the ancient Stoics believed the same thing, like, and they want to turn it into this kind of doctrinaire sort of religious approach. And if you don't believe in the kind of religious dogmas, then you're not really, doing Stoicism or something like that. And that seems to me really at odds with what Socrates was doing and what the Stoics were doing, because for them, philosophy was not a religion in that sense, that it was a bunch of dogmas that are kind of accepted on faith. Like, they thought our ability to reason was fundamental. So Socrates did have firm beliefs, but for him they were arrived at through a process of reasoning, and he remained open-minded about them. Yeah. So Socrates would say sometimes, for example, I've really questioned this idea. I'll give you an example. And it's a paradox, right? It's because many of the conclusions that Socrates arrives at are called Socratic paradoxes. So a famous one is that no man does evil willingly. And another one is that someone who acts unjustly does more harm to themselves than they do to the victim. Like, he repeats that several times, and he's quite adamant about it. And he'll often say, I know that no one agrees with me, right? But whenever I've interrogated people about this position, I find it that I end up refuting the contrary position, and this one stands up. Like, it doesn't get refuted. So some people say Socrates doesn't think his method can allow him to arrive at certainty, but in a kind of provisional way, he can say, so far, like, this opinion that I hold hasn't been refuted, even though I've repeatedly applied my method to it. Like, so I've got a kind of provisional certainty about it. Like, the belief is resilient. Like, I've tried to disprove it, and I haven't succeeded in doing so far. So that's where his kind of opinions come from, and why sometimes he'll actually very explicitly say, "I firmly believe this," and I'll repeat it. He'll say, "I'm repeating it again," like, but he's open to questioning those kind of ethical doctrines. He just thinks that so far no one has actually convinced him that they're contradictory or false.